Sorry, I've got pop-ups coming on my screen. So UKCDR is a collaborative on development research. We are a neutral and impartial entity working with the UK research funders who have an interest in development research. As such, we work with UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation Agency. We work with FCDO, DHSC, which is the Department of Health, and also BASE, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, alongside the Wellcome Trust. By bringing these funders together, we try and ensure that there is coherence and coordination how ODA money or development aid money is spent into research to address the sustainable development goals. Our vision as UKCDR is to accelerate global development through the power of knowledge and research. Can't click forward. Here we go. So the three main areas that we work on are in terms of mapping, convening, and sharing information. So we do a lot of data mapping to produce funders with an overview of the funding landscapes, who fund what, how to coordinate, and how to avoid duplication. We also convene the funders thematically around certain area where bringing them together can actually make a difference. And we share information by developing good practice guidance, such as the one that we are going to present today. And our aim overall is to bridge the gap between what research is funded and how research is conducted. So why Equitable Partnership? Back in 2019, we had a joint meeting with the African Academy of Science, where we convened the IRDFF, which is a group of international funders with an interest in research development. And at this meeting, we were discussing Equitable Research Partnership. And we realized as a group that there was a need to address and that collectively we needed to respond to that need. At that meeting, funders identified 10 different ways that they could influence equitable partnerships for research. Since then, we've produced 3 major outputs. The first one, on our website, we do have an Equitable Partnership Resource Hub, which is basically what we hope to be a one-stop shop for the community, be it funder, academics, or research manager, to come and find useful resources to tackle the topic of equity in research partnership. I think we currently have along 42 or 45 resources, so I would urge you to go and have a look if you're not aware of it. Another output was a blog series that we released earlier this year about equitable partnership, but from a practitioner point of view. And finally, and the topic of today's presentation, is a good practice guidance that we developed collaboratively with Essence on Health on 4 approaches to supporting equitable research partnership. And I just want to point that this document has also been translated in French. So this visual is something that a lot of people have mentioned, and because it is a very good representation as to what inhibits equity in research partnership to the left, but also to the right, what can be put in place to make sure that research partnership, especially between the North and the South, flourish. All those words come from a survey that we conducted as part of this project. And on the left, in terms of barriers to equity, you can see things like exclusion, lack of resources, misunderstanding, or paternalism. On the other hand, to the right, if you do have shared priority, shared values, skills exchange, new knowledge, then you can see that the ecosystem can flourish. So now you're going to tell me that, we've been speaking about equitable partnership for a long time. There are lots of resources, and we are very much aware of that. And the intention is absolutely not to reinvent the wheel. The USP of this document is that it was developed by a task force of global research funders. It contains 4 interconnected approaches to supporting equitable research partnership. And it also provides practical recommendation at 3 different levels: for the research funders, but also institutionally, and finally, at the level of the research teams themselves. In the document, you can find a series of case studies that have been developed, and also we've collated a quite extensive list of existing resources. How the project was done, we started with a global survey, and we had over 400 responses. we set up 5 different consultative groups. We reviewed extensively existing literature, and we developed the case studies that I mentioned earlier. This is just a very quick snapshot to show you how the practical recommendations are presented in the document itself. So per recommendation, we do have for the funders, for the research institutions, and for the researchers. And the idea is basically for you to pick an approach and to look at, to make a sort of checklist of what you should be mindful of. So I'm now going to briefly present the 4 different approaches that are presented in the document. The first one is the more holistic view about supporting the research partnership ecosystem. So it's at the very high level, what can be done. And sorry, my slides sometimes don't move forward. Here we go. So at the partnership ecosystem, the first thing is a value mindset, is whether we actually do value equity in research partnerships. So this is primordial. This is the first thing to bear in mind. And then it's about taking a holistic approach to equity. And by holistic approach, we refer to things like agenda setting, funding decisions that have to be equitable, management and leadership, and also at the level of outputs and impacts. So basically all along the life cycle of the research project. It is also about addressing power imbalances between LMIC leadership and ownership, institutional relationship building, and also ensuring greater involvement in LMIC institutions in policy and decision-making process. And finally, and we can't stress that enough, it's about long-term thinking and long-term sustainability. Approach 2, we go down one level, and it's about strengthening research relationships and research systems. In that area, some things that we will not stress enough is two-way learning. We have to learn from one another. The North has to learn a lot from the South, and that often is not very much discussed in that notion of equity. Knowledge of context is key as well. We have to build mutual understanding of context as a starting point, and also knowledge of LMIC's political economy, research ecosystem, and challenges. What are the priorities we are trying to address together? In terms of strengthening the research relationships themselves, it's all about the co-design, the co-creation, and the co-ownership. And also, we need to ensure that there is enhanced capacity at the individual, institutional, and ecosystem level. And finally, again, something that we can't stress enough is investment in research management. This is absolutely crucial for equitability and redressing power imbalances. Approach number 3, we go a bit more into the nitty-gritty of the partnerships themselves, is about budgeting for partnership building. So in terms of budgeting, we have to bear in mind that supporting the partnership development and co-design at different stages is very important. And seed funding, availability of pump priming to develop this consortium, to make sure that we discuss priorities from the onset are very important. Involvement of research managers, as we mentioned before, and also facilitation of staff exchanges in both directions, and consortium building activity as early as possible so that the consortium is in the best possible position to respond to calls when the call is announced. That's at the start, but at the end of the research cycle, we have to be mindful that we have to budget for follow-on funding and also for support engagement and dissemination activity. All of that with a mindset of promoting transdisciplinarity, a type of research where we do have interaction of a wide variety of stakeholders, policymaker, decision maker, community, and that we want to go beyond the normal academic output. And also in terms of budgeting, what would be really important is to have direct funding to LMIC institution and a different flow of funding from the north to the south. The last approach, and that's going very much into the very detail of research partnership, is about implementing processes and procedures that sustain those partnerships. In that area, we cover items such as governance arrangements, just making sure that we speak the same language, that we understand each other, and that we are mindful of the context that we are all working in. And the same goes with the terms of research, whether due diligence, costing, intellectual property have to be discussed straight from the start of the proposal, and ethical review. And finally, it is very important that we put in place strong monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. So that's it for a very quick overview of the presentation of the document. Do get in touch if you do have any question. I'm now going to hand over to Alice, who is going to introduce the panel and start with the moderation. And please do put your questions in the chat function. I will be monitoring that. Thank you very much for your attention. Alice?
Thanks, Maggie. So building upon the presentation of the document, we put together an esteemed panel of 4 who are going to provide some additional reflections from their own experiences and also link this issue of equitable partnerships to the core topic of today's conference. So I'm very happy to say that the 4 panelists have come from different perspectives and are going to offer kind of different perspectives on this issue. So firstly, we have Professor Rodrigo Carrera Oliveira, who's the Vice President for Research and Biological Collections at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, or Fiocruz in Brazil. He is responsible for the development of strategic activities related to research on health-related aspects, and Fiocruz has a large network of international collaboration partners in human health, from basic science to social and epidemiological research. And he has a PhD in immunology from the Johns Hopkins University. So thanks for joining us very early, Rodrigo. And next we have Dr. Joel Onyango, who's a senior research fellow at the African Center for Technology Studies. And he's worked for over 10 years in research and management, focusing on science and technology and innovation, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, water quality, security and access, food security, and sustainable development. He has extensive experience leading partnerships in international development research, and he also has a specific interest in decolonizing knowledge and learning systems, which will be crucial for contribution to this conversation. Next, we have Dr. Johannes Atella, who I don't think needs much introduction to the participants of this conference, as he's the convener of the Africa Research and Impact Network. But he's also a senior research fellow and head of the Climate Resilient Economies Program at the African Center for Technology Studies. And he coordinates North-South research partnerships for the African Center for Technology Studies through the Africa Sustainability Hub, so providing that crucial experience of negotiating those partnerships. And finally, we have Juliette Oluoch, who is here offering a youth perspective. She's an environment, climate change advocate and researcher, and a research assistant, Deputy National Coordinator at the Africa Youth Initiative on Climate Chapter, and a full member of the Commonwealth Youth Climate Network. So thank you to the 4 panelists for joining us. I will now, the first question that I wanted to ask, and it's really about connecting the issue of equitable partnerships with the theme of the 3rd day of the ARIN conference. So how do you think equitable partnerships, or focusing on equitable partnerships, can contribute to decolonizing research? And I'm going to ask that first to Dr. Joel Onyango. Are you able to offer a perspective on that?
Thanks a lot, Alice, and thanks to the ARIN fraternity for the invite to continue this conversation. I think we've been talking about decoloniality, decolonizing different perspectives of knowledge and learning systems. And when I hear about how continuing with this kind of conversation helps in rethinking and remodeling research, one of the things that comes to mind, and already highlighted by Maggie here, is the aspect of diversity. I mean, decolonizing that process really opens up the space for us to value the diversity that comes along with that. I mean, there are different expertise, there are different ways of thinking when it comes to research. You open that space on decoloniality, then you start valuing how different people can contribute from different contexts, from different cultures. Ideally, in so doing, I'm talking about decoloniality, you start seeing people being more able to challenge power, challenging the incumbency. And challenging incumbency really is a fundamental bit of what we call methodological rebellion. My colleague from Umbela likes saying that methodological rebellion, building it in research, is anchored in being able to decolonize the processes of, through which we carry out research. And finally, I think decoloniality also opens up the space for us to think about research in different angles. What Maggie has just presented, thinking about research funding, gender issues when it comes to research, hierarchies when it comes to research, decoloniality conversations and decoloniality processes does help us start thinking about that multidimensionality when you think about research. And in the end, I mean, it's not about throwing the old and on with the new. It's about finding a way of bringing the old and the new together in the right context for us to be able to work together with different partners. And categorically, perhaps mentioning that the connotation of global north, global south always has already a coloniality perspective of it. I'm wondering whether for the conversation, I like the distinction that Maggie made on high income countries and low and middle income countries, because that then describes a characteristic that is useful, because then the global north, global south is almost like we are trying to further fertilize the conversation on coloniality by having that perspective. Over to you, Alice. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. Yeah, I always struggle with the issue of what the right language around global north and south, and I know people have different perspectives on it, so it's really interesting to hear yours. And thanks for bridging that idea of both the kind of different diverse knowledges, but also the systems that produce them as well. I think that's really important. Professor Rodrigo, can I bring you in on this question as well? So what do you see as the connection between equitable partnerships and decolonizing research, perhaps from your?
I think Dr. Nyago did touch several very important points, and I think that the way I see most of the time the aspect of decolonizing the research has to do a lot with in the past. I'm going to go back a little bit. In the past, the way that research was dealt with was based on how the developed countries saw that research should be done, and how you should actually develop the research in different areas that are mainly areas where, for example, the infectious disease like that affect the least developed countries, for example, and that the way they thought that the research should be done. Not necessarily the way the individuals from these countries saw the need for that research should be done. In other words, I think that the way the themes that were decided not necessarily matched the themes that were needed, and that actually led to a point that the research was done did not have that impact that you actually needed to have in the populations. The lack of conversations, and actually the lack of having a discussion where people from the least developed countries would demonstrate what was necessary to do the research, and not what the funders, mainly the funders are from the developed countries, thought that the research was needed to be done. Its effects, for example, if you had I'm going to take my area of immunology, the individuals will say, oh, I need to understand that aspect of immunology, but that will not have the necessary impact in the population, for example. So you could study immunology, but in a way that the impact would come the population based on the need that the people from the countries that the disease was would actually lead that kind of research. So I think that the lack of interaction that occurred for many years, and that still occur at some level, actually is impeded in several circumstances how you can actually take that finding and can lead the research to have an impact in the population. I hope I was clear. So over to you, Alice. I think too early for you.
No, very clear. Yeah, I appreciate it's very early in the morning for you.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm trying to get the machine started, you know.
Yeah, thank you. I think you touched upon a really good thing that we're thinking about equitable partnerships. We often sort of just think at the sort of academic level, but actually, especially given the other sort of themes of this conference, there's something much broader around the types of knowledge that are included and who kind of makes decisions about what is researched and where, which I think are really important. I was just going to offer the opportunity for Johannes or Juliet to come in on this question if they want to, otherwise we'll move on to the next question. Johannes, did you have anything you wanted to? I'll take the silence as a no, but moving onwards, and again to Joel, I'm wondering from your own experiences, have you found any aspects that from your own experiences in working in research partnerships have particularly supported working in an equitable way? And maybe you can share some of your ideas around what some of those structures or principles are that can support equitable working. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I think I'll sort of mention 4 things that I would consider to be, characteristics or areas that collectively would be useful for equitable partnership. One of it is about reflexivity. In any context, when you're talking about equitable partnerships, in research, in development, in innovation systems, the first person who can identify the niche in which you are being involved in is the first person, so the me in it. So having this self-reflexivity allows, in any kind of setting, in any kind of study, any kind of research, collaborative and partnership, therefore, to people to appreciate the diversity in it. And as they say, no one is going to tell you when you are not successful in your own self. You have to self-reflect. So one of the characteristics I think would be useful for equitable partnership is being able to look at yourself, your positionality, and how your positionality interacts with other people in the team, other institutions, other partners within your research. The other factor I would consider is we already know that there is differences, power differences. Fighting the power differences is useful, but recognizing that it exists and therefore collectively as a partnership, figuring out how to balance it. And I like, like what Rodrigo has mentioned, that context matters, and recognizing that we are in different contexts, we're in different areas of doing things, we're in different capacities to influence, different level of agency is important, because then the roles in which you'll be able to participate in the partnerships becomes a bit clearer. So I find this room for recognizing that there are differences, there are power differences especially, is important as a characteristic to ensure that there is equitable partnership along the way. The other thing is about some of these spaces where the researchers, I want to use the word, the low middle income researchers in a partnership, one of the things is that they rarely speak about their ideas, where they want to be, what they want to do in a project. So there's a partnership, but a lot of the ideas that pass and go along the way, even within the partnership itself, not just within the delivery of the research, is often driven by not being able to say what you want or complaining later, so this is an opportunity for you to say, this is how I want the research, this is the method I think should fit here, this is this is my own context of what should happen, but I don't speak. I keep quiet about it, and I say yes, and then I complain later, and then I come to the workshop and I say, this is unfair, global, not global stuff, but I don't speak. So the opportunity for people to think about scholarly activism within that. Are you able to be an advocate of your own work and build your own agency? The last thing, and I already started mentioning, is that building a movement towards methodological rebellion, it is a characteristic in some sense of promoting this equitability, because then you build the agency so people are able to talk. So, the idea of scholarly activism, people are able to reflect on the key things in which they're delivering in, and people are also able to recognize the power differences. So I would say these 4 things: reflexivity, recognizing there's a difference in power, there's an imbalance already, so how do you deal with it in terms of solution and case by case and context basis? Building a movement towards scholarly activism in the sense that we are building people who can challenge the dominant, building the opportunity and providing an opportunity to challenge the dominant narratives. Thank you, Alice. Back to you.
Thank you. So it's about both having those opportunities to challenge, but also being able to do it and talk about when something doesn't make sense from your own context or from your own intellectual point of view as well. That's really, really great. Thank you. Maybe we can bring Johannes in at this point to answer the question in a slightly different way, which is, so from your experience, what has prevented or blocked equitable working between perhaps partners from your own context and those in higher income countries or even other countries in lower middle income countries? Are you able to offer answer the same question, but from the other side?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alice. And yeah, just to correct that, I'm no longer the head of the climate change program. So yeah, there's a bit of me. Joel now heads the climate change program. I'm really happy to make some points here. I think the discussions from the previous speakers have highlighted some fundamental issues, because equitable partnerships is part of the SDGs, the global goal number 17. But many a times it has been treated from the peripheries in terms of just people talking about partnerships, but there hasn't been really dedicated focus and work to try and see what are the principles, what are the underpinning elements, which I want to congratulate the UKCDR for really taking that opportunity to begin to look into the system and try to tease out some of the most important things when it comes to equitable. What does it mean, especially for the work that is ongoing currently in terms of trying to address the challenges that we face as a globe. We have fundamental challenges on climate change. We have fundamental challenges. We just said COVID, and all these, require, equitable partnerships so that we have all hands on deck in a way that, is able to respond and help to address the challenge. And, in ways that do not reinforce existing inequalities. One big problem, actually, in Africa, as we are also having discussions in this broader conference, is the element of inequalities and how the way we work with each other helps to either address, reduce those inequalities or reinforce those particular inequalities. So this remains a very fundamental question, even as we look at some of the specific issues that we are trying to address on climate change. We're talking about, we're just from the Sharm el-Sheikh, and Maggie, we met there, and one of the questions that we is being addressed currently is the element of loss and damage, where there is a lot of passion around, loss and damage financing. So if you look at that in the context of really the different segments of the community or the society, especially those who are affected most by the impacts of climate change, what is their place in the discussion around equitable partnership? And that brings me to the first point I want to mention, that equitable partnerships and of course some of these fundamental principles should really help to strengthen the voices of the marginalized in the debates that we have, in the global challenges that we are trying to address. We are not doing research for the sake of doing research. We are not doing experiments for the sake of it. We are not, people have written papers, and most of us here have written many papers. So, papers and all that is not the great thing anymore. What is important is that how do we ensure that we bring in the voices of the people who need the knowledge into this particular space. And this is why equitable partnership is very important. It's not about the partnership just about, for the researchers and the people making decisions. It's about partnerships also for people who really are supposed to be supported or benefit from this particular decision. So the question of how do we profile the local, the marginalized voices in the processes that we undertake in research, but also in policy decision, is number one fundamental thing. The number two thing I want to highlight is the element of, I think, decoloniality, which I think Joel has talked about. And decoloniality more broadly is about really opening up and creating democratic spaces. You know, of course, we have, most of us have privileged spaces, privileges to knowledge, privileges to finances, privileges to different things. But how do we use those privileged spaces to be able to, you know, really support or link up to the unprivileged or underprivileged people? And that calls for the broader concern around decolonizing, you know, the processes through which we engage in. I mean, you know, trying to open up and ensuring that really we are able to bring or use whatever privileges we have to be much more equitable or much more, you know, supportive to the underprivileged in that particular nature. And this can cut across many things. You know, when you talk about research, it can be about funding, it can be about, you know, the research methodologies. You know, look at the way funding for research is structured. Really, you realize that, you know, it's a question of competition. It's a question of those who can, you know, write stronger methodologies, those who can provide very good, you know, write-up in terms of the English and all that. But what about those who really can solve the problem, but perhaps they can't write the best English in the world? You know, do we just tell them, you know, put them away? I mean, or, you know, how do we bring them in so that even when we are making decisions when it comes to funding research or funding any interventions, we are more inclusive and everybody feels that they're winners and they're contributing what they need to contribute to the process without, you know, one person or one you know, institution or organization taking it on. And yeah, so that's very fundamental. Look, and this can apply in many places, not just the funding. But most importantly, and finally, Alice, I know I've taken so much time, is the element of the processes. You know, equitable partnership, as I've said, is in the processes that really define this partnership. It's about these kinds of, you know, steps that are important in terms of, you know, what we do, the decisions that we make, the conversations that are being made, the people who are able to make decisions on behalf of others to be able to arrive to certain outcomes or whatever. So we need to look at it, we need to look inside and open the processes and ensure that equitable partnerships are actually intersectional across, you know, within the processes and of course within the kind of outcomes and outputs that comes from those particular processes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I think there's something really important there around how we think about equitable partnerships, not just in kind of an academic context, but also working with communities, strengthening the voice of marginalized people and thinking about who research is really for. And also, I think one point we were trying to address within this document was this idea of the structures that define relationships and how they need to be changed as they come from kind of a historic and current unequal system. So I'm really glad that you touched upon that. I'd like to bring in Juliet at this point, and apologies because I was working off an outdated bio for you, but you are an early career research fellow at ARIN, so I just wanted to clarify that. And I wanted to ask you about sort of moving from some of the challenges to think about what some of the changes that you think are needed from your own perspective or experience to support more equitable partnerships within the global research system. Thanks. Over to you, Juliet.
Very much, Alice. I hope I'm audible enough. So firstly, I'd like to really start from what Maggie presented earlier about UKCDR's work and your perspective in terms of achieving equitable partnerships. And it was very clear that equity in research is central in achieving that impact. And this calls for inclusion of all groups in the research as a collaborative endeavor. So I think the starting point for me and what I think is really important at this stage is to ensure that there is that aspect of inclusion. Oftentimes we, or most of the times, these research projects are led and funded by the, did you call them high income countries, who oftentimes they come with already complete research questions, which is either disregarding the customs and traditions of indigenous communities, of the youths, of these marginalized groups, or either does not even include their needs. And that shows that there is a gap in terms of inclusion of research. But decolonization of research really should create a significant opportunity to redefine the meaning of research from and within the community. And this therefore means that research needs to be an ongoing action with the participants, or rather with the communities that are involved. And if we have to define the meaning of science, then it has to be from the community's perspective. Let us bring in the young people, let us bring in the old people, let us bring in all these people right from the inception stage and not just during the implementation process. I think, and history can tell that the indigenous communities, the local groups have been living sustainably on their land for centuries with their traditional knowledge and culture, which have been so sustainable. And how to redefine the meaning of research, it has to be for the community. Research needs to be based on local knowledge, and local knowledge holders therefore need to be included as a significant part of the research. And when I talk about local knowledge holders, I'm talking about women and girls. I'm talking about the youth. I'm talking about the old generation. I'm talking about the people with disabilities. So we need to identify objectives of our research according to the suggestions from these special or indigenous groups of people. Their voices and their needs have to be prioritized in selecting the research topics and the research questions, and they have to be included in the entire research process. I also believe that with research, it is an opportunity for these communities to speak up for their rights, for their justice, and against oppression. Oftentimes, we struggle with knowledge translation. After we come up with all these good papers, we really struggle to break this down to the community. And that is because they are not involved right from the inception stage. So it is important that we empower them in that way so that they are able to speak up for their own. They're able to fight for their rights and, you know, just speak, let the research speak for itself. So, and finally, I think it is important that we really consider this indigenous knowledge equal to scientific knowledge, and try as much as possible to bring everybody in the picture, because then I think that is what Equitable Partnerships is all about. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Julia. And it's a really good call there for inclusion across the whole research process, and actually even rethinking what we think of as research and what knowledge counts within some of the traditional research systems. I just wanted to, I'm going to ask one more question of a panelist before I open it up to the audience, because I'm aware we've got some questions in the chat. I was going to ask Rodrigo to reflect upon, from your experience and perspective, of what you think some of the changes that are needed to support equitable research partnerships within funding organizations. Thank you. Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. I think one way that we can do that is by actually getting the partners together and developing the ideas that we would put together. One way that we have been doing that is by finding partners that are interested in solving, discussing different issues of research in Brazil, for example, and co-funding part of giving seed money for that project to actually be developed. For example, I'm going to give an example that's quite new, quite not actually the second round, but we just at the call. We have a program with the Queen Mary University of London and two organizations in Brazil. One is Fiocruz, the one where I am, and the other one is another foundation called Fundação Getúlio Vargas. That's actually a school of economy, and that we actually want to put health, economy, and some of the issues that Juliet just mentioned together, and actually develop a study together based on the needs of some areas in Brazil. So the call was based on how you can actually be working with marginalized populations and understand the needs of these marginalized populations in terms of developing new programs that will help them actually develop into a community that can take children into schools, maintain them in schools. How you can actually have, for example, there's a big issue that of menstrual safety that we call in Brazil. I don't know if that's correct, the correct word, in marginalized population and in populations that are spread in the interior of Brazil. So these are issues of research that are very important for populations that are in least developed countries that may not be a situation in the developed countries. But the issue was to develop here a program where we can actually bring these ideas and these discussions to the table and actually develop research on that. These are just one thing that two things that I have just came to my mind that came up in the program. So by putting together the Queen Mary University of London, Fiocruz, and Fundação Getúlio Vargas, we have a whole program with different ideas in different areas that are very important, but they complement each other. So it is a way that we can actually brought a lot of issues on the table and to discuss and develop programs.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that example. It's I think would be really helpful for the audience. We've actually got a kind of slightly related question to what I asked in the chat from Francesco Albino. So they're asking what the speakers think of the role of national funding agencies and national research institutions as opposed to international in supporting a culture of equitable research collaboration. So do any of the panelists want to come in on that question? So talking more at the kind of national level of what funding agencies and research institutions can do to support that culture.
I think that one of the ways that can be done is basically developing an international network of collaboration together with other funding agencies. And this is, I think it's the best way to do it, because you can bring all the discussion from your own agencies to the floor together with the international agencies. This has been quite successful in some of the discussions that we have promoted in Brazil with our funding agencies. We have different funding agencies that do that. And at us at Fiocruz, we also put together different agencies to discuss some of the issues that are important for Brazil. For example, I would have a very big discussion on One Health. And this is an issue that was already touched here by the panelists. And that actually is bringing a lot of interest from other countries on how to discussion related to that, an emergency of new diseases, etc.
Thank you. So we've also, Claire shared an interesting question in the chat. I don't know if you're there, Claire, and you wanted to explain a bit more and ask your question live.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just saying that yeah, I was recently I'm in a project that involves Brazil as well and Ecuador. And we did a workshop recently in which we asked the team members how they think the project is going. So we ended up we asked them to fill out on a bit of paper and we just collected it anonymously. So that was quite interesting because people were fairly forthcoming with what they thought because it was anonymous. So it's quite helpful because we're in the first 6 months of the project. So it's really helpful to get people's input. But I just wondered if the panel had any specific examples of good practice which they felt worked well.
Thank you, Claire. So for the panel, anyone who has examples of kind of good research practice that can support that working with communities and getting that feedback from them that you're taking the right approach. So any examples from the panelists?
I do a lot of research with communities, so we have a lot of the work that we did actually together with the groups of people from the US. And it's also led by the Brazilians and in communities, and also developing basic research too. There was a lot of interest in community. The word is engagement, and that came up to, if that's exactly what Claire is asking. Community engagement turned out to be very, very important, and the turnout was based on the educational program and actually development of the projects together with the communities and what they needed. So that was quite successful, if I understood your question correctly, Claire.
Sorry, Alice, I wasn't talking about communities. I was talking about the research team itself.
Sorry.
Okay. We have another program with Pasteur, the Pasteur network, and the fact that we do interaction between institutes, Pasteur institutes, and the University of São Paulo and Fiocruz, there was a very high levels interest in that, and the success of the program turned out to be the fact that they wanted the programs also seed money, and the fact that we were able to promote interaction with the different institutes at Pasteur and Fiocruz and also the University of São Paulo. So the feedback that we got from them is that that kind of program led them to get more funding, high level funding from other organizations too. So it's been highly positive. That's the way I see from these programs.
Thanks, Rodrigo and Claire. Sorry for misunderstanding your question. We had another question that actually, Joel, you'd started to answer in the chat, which is around whether the decolonization is relevant to discussing national research funding and research systems. I know you've added something in the chat on that, but I was wondering whether you could expand upon that live for the audience. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Building on what Rodrigo is saying, I mean, we've also done something that tries to co-design technological solutions. It's often there's this example that I like giving about the cooking technology that was introduced in many African countries. And after a couple of years, everybody took the stoves that people were being given as part of a very noble idea to decarbonize the cooking system, cooking industry, at the local level. And they took all these stoves and put them aside, and they're using them as storage spaces rather than cooking systems, because ideally the context in which they were needed wasn't being met. And now in a process of clean cooking space, process of modernizing cooking, you see that you need to come up with technologies. And I think Dr. Taylor is leading an initiative in that regard, leading an initiative that how the cooking technology that is being proposed meets the social cultural context. And that ties to my response to the question, because the innovation system and even the funding system at a national level is often, it presents this elitism, like there are people who know and the people who do not know, and therefore it keeps propagating the idea that, they are the top people who understand the context most. And there are the people who are supposed to just be beneficiaries receiving whatever solutions that are being funded to be shared. So at the national level, even when you're looking at high income and low income spaces, at the national level we have I want to say the have and the have nots, and there's a propagation of elitists who sit at the top, and they determine what happens to a context that they might not even understand. In different governance systems. And at the same time, as this continues growing, what we start seeing is that there is some kind of political hegemony. There is historically things or people or areas that have been set aside, and there's sort of an area that has been prioritized in many systems. And as we continue propagating this historical hegemonies, what results is there's still unequal partnerships, and when even at national level now we are talking about unequal partnerships, it means that there's someone else who's responsible for resources at the national level, someone else is responsible for policy decisions, for technology decisions, and all these people are continuously in the same club. So this club makes decisions for a lot of other people who then benefit. So that's in a nutshell what I was trying to explain, that even at the national level, there's still levels of hierarchy that disrupt what should otherwise be more inclusive, equitable partnerships.
Thanks. I think that's something really important to add to this conversation, is that those inequities can exist within countries and communities. It's not just a between country aspect. So that's a really important perspective. So Dr. Atella had actually a call for his other panelists around. So Juliet talked about the role of marginalized voices in shaping research and partnerships. And I was wondering whether any of the panelists here have any examples they can share of where that has worked either particularly well or where it has worked and there's been challenges, or any examples that other people can learn from of trying to open up the research process and make it more inclusive with marginalized voices and communities. So anyone would like to comment on that?
Yeah, okay, if you allow me to just expand on that, the question a bit, and maybe Juliet to respond, because she spoke quite passionately about the marginalized. Often, most times we speak about the need to support these marginalized groups, the need to bring their voice, and their aspirations are always represented by third parties, like, you know, the researchers like us. What are we doing really to ensure that, you know, these marginalized groups are also able to, you know, speak for themselves, they're able to access these spaces and platforms so that their aspirations are always not, because this is a long-standing narrative, you know, we need to include communities, gender, and where's gender? Where are the communities? So this, where are they? Where are these people? You know, and when, in which year or which century will they come to, so that they can be, so this is something that maybe Juliet, in your work, the youth, you could reply to.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Atella, for raising that. And I think it is a very pertinent issue, which we cannot run away from, because as we have seen, and I agree, I think one of the participants really who's also worked with the Indigenous community can attest that, you know, once you try to engage these special groups of people, then you realize the gap that has been existing, you know, in terms of the knowledge gap that has been existing between the seasoned researchers, or rather those who already have this knowledge, and those people who have Indigenous knowledge, but they are just keeping this knowledge for themselves. So I think one of the ways in which we can ensure that these voices have been included, as I mentioned, would be one, to consult them in terms of finding out what they are actually going through in coming up with a research question about a community. Then we need to have a representation of the same people who are part of the research that you are doing, and just trying to find out what are some of the challenges they are going through. They are able to explain this in a more organic way, as opposed to having you know, a panel of expert researchers talking about issues affecting a community without really having any representation of such persons in that community. And this has for a long time been, you know, one of those cries of such groups. They're like, you are talking about us, but without us. Then how are we sure that whatever we're addressing is really the actual solution to the problem? So one of the very key ways is to ensure that we involve these groups, and involving them doesn't mean bringing them in the implementation stage, but at the start of coming up with the research question, let us have them as part of that process. And also take advantage of the Indigenous knowledge. Like I mentioned, it is important to also treat this as scientific knowledge, because what really needs to be done is we need to harness the knowledge that they already have and come up with solutions, but really paying attention to what they have to say, and really focusing our research towards addressing whatever the issue they have. So in simple terms, I think that is the only really feasible way of addressing the issue of inclusion and equitable partnership between researchers and communities.
Thanks, Juliet. And I think that's a very, although I think this conversation could have continued for a lot longer, I think we're going to have to leave it there given time. And I think actually your points are a very useful kind of call to leave it upon, with those, how some of those things that people need to consider in terms of inclusion and opening up the research process. So I'm just going to hand back to Maggie, who's going to wrap up the session.
Just because before she comes in, I think I can see a question from Dr. Atela, and it's saying, how do we define vulnerable or marginalized? So I think this is quite simple. When we are talking about vulnerable, it is actually, when I talk about a vulnerable group, then what do I mean? It is that person who is, if it is about climate change, it is that person who is facing the first-hand impacts of climate change. That person who is, you know, affected, that lady who is not going to school because there's a river somewhere that is flooded, that physically are that person with disability who is not able to do something because of a climate-related consequence. So I think those are the kind of people that come into my mind when we think about vulnerable or marginalized. It is these people who are experiencing the first-hand impacts of climate change.
So the people most impacted by the issue. I think that's a really, really helpful way of thinking about it. Over to you, Maggie.
Well, as Alice said, this is a sort of topic that we could spend the entire afternoon debating. So it was a very rich discussion. Thank you very much for the panelists and also the question we had in the chat this morning. My takeaway from the session, so the first thing is, Joel, the language, global south, global north, as opposed to high income, low middle income countries. Yeah, very much take on board. And as Alice mentioned, you know, there is this whole discussion about what is the right language to use. So hopefully we're going to make progress in that sense. My second takeaway point is from Johannes, who mentioned that equitable partnership is part of SDG 17, partnership for the goal, yet often it comes as a peripheral topic. We are currently attending the World Science Forum, which theme is Science for Social Justice, and equitable partnership is discussed a lot in that conference. I would like to see us move from, you know, chatting about it, which is what we've done this morning, and we need to talk about it, to how can we actually do something and not in 10 years' time. And the third takeaway point was very much the need to strengthen the voices of marginalized people, and that equity in research is essential for impact, and the need to value traditional knowledge. And lastly, I'm going to go back to what you mentioned, Joel, because I think that's a very good few points to take away for reflection, is your point about self-reflexivity, recognizing the power imbalance, advocating, and I like your idea of methodological rebellion, challenging the dominant narrative. And I finally saw that in the chat, you put a question that is certainly food for thought for me. What degree of inclusiveness in partnerships is just? So I think that's a question to ponder on. Thank you for putting that forward. Thank you very much for attending. Very much appreciated. I think it was a great session, and we're very happy to keep the discussion going. So thank you very much for attending. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
And